Thanks for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here, and thanks to the USIP Alliance and UC Berkeley for organizing this event and for inviting me. I'm really honored to be here. I think that there is a lot that we can learn about diversity and innovation by looking at the academic literature that has addressed this topic. And we will see that there is some literature that goes back 20 years, that there is some literature that's right on the cutting edge that is very recent. We will discuss a large breadth of it. Now, first, I want to recognize that I'm a professor at the University of Georgia. I'm a patent attorney. Therefore, I'm likely to view diversity and innovation through the lens of patents, of intellectual property. And I recognize that there is a great deal of invention, of innovation that occurs outside of the patent realm, but consistent with the literature, which is commonly used, patent behavior as a metric of innovation. That is what we are going to largely look at today. One other limitation, which I want to recognize from the very beginning, and that is that the idea of innovation, invention, and diversity could be very, very broad, yet the academic literature thus far has largely only looked to gender and racial diversity. So that's what we're going to end up talking about in large part today, though I recognize there are tremendous avenues for future research. So first question is, well, why innovation? Why do we care about innovation? And many of you are familiar with studies that talk about how on a very macro level, innovation drives efficient use of labor, it drives economic growth, it drives quality of life. So when we invent, we all do better. Now, looking from a much more micro perspective, what about the firm level? Because I recognize that many of you represent or from private firms, and in that area, there's plenty of literature which describes how innovation drives firm performances. Innovative, inventive firms do better. It creates a competitive advantage. And we see that these micro and macro outcomes are symbiotic in nature, in that they have the capacity to build off of each other. When an individual at a firm invents and publicly discloses that new technology via a patent or a published patent application, others recognize, oh, that's a great idea. I'm going to try to build off of it, or I'm going to try to invent around that patent such that I can achieve the same end without having to use their patented technology. Either way, we are adding to the aggregate store of knowledge, and we all win. Now, I said we are going to give a very broad overview of the literature from academia on diversity and innovation. And we're going to largely break these into two primary categories, 6 subcategories. The first essentially talks about the lay of the land, where we currently stand with regard to diversity and innovation. And first, we'll look to descriptive data on inventors as a function of race and gender, see where we currently stand. Second, we will look to what a lot of people view as being a stepping stone towards invention, which is a STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, education. And we will look to participation in STEM as a function of race and gender. Second, we move into a slightly distinct area of research, and we will look to various impediments that occur for inventors and how we might learn from this to achieve greater diversity and invention. And we will see that this opens up a lot of discussions for future research into a third area of research, which is what happens within the firm that can either achieve or potentially discourage innovation and diversity. And I think that that is an interesting area with a great deal of overlap between academics like myself and then people who are working at private firms, people who represent private firms, perhaps people who are in other areas of academia. And on that point, I highly encourage you, if you have ways in which you think we can further this literature with things you want to talk about, reach out to me. Reach out to the authors of these articles that I'm going to discuss and see to what extent there may be some mutually beneficial ability to address certain topics that haven't to this point been researched. Okay, so I wanted to start out with an anecdote, about 10 years old now, that addresses why diversity in innovation can achieve more efficient, better results in invention. Now, it's kind of a funny, silly example, but it gets the point across. There was this line of study in the life sciences in which researchers agreed that humans and other mammals gain a great deal of information by looking at the eyes of others. If I were looking at your eyes, I could say, oh, they're bored. They're looking at someone else. They're looking down. They're currently texting. And there were two different explanations for this behavior. Some in the area believed that humans and mammals are hardwired to look at the center of someone else's face. And then you saw their eyes because it's in the center of their face. And that is just a bonus that you get the information from the eyes. Another line of thought believed that we are hardwired to look at the eyes for the very purpose of garnering that information. And these people wanted to resolve this question, but the researchers were incapable because in reality, our eyes are in the middle of our head. Therefore, it's really hard to tell if people innately look here because it's the center of the head or at the eyes. One of the researchers takes his question home. He's talking to his 12-year-old son. I believe this was in England, if I recall correctly. And he raises the issue and the problem that they can't figure out a way to test whether we're looking at the eyes or the center of the face. And the son steps back. The son thinks about it, goes, Dad, I've got you. Let's look to Dungeons and Dragons. And that seems silly. What the son is proposing is that in Dungeons and Dragons, we have all of these monsters. A great many of them have their eyes out on the periphery of their head, as opposed to in the center of their face. He said, let's make digital depictions of these monsters and then watch where people's eyes go when they look at the digital depictions. Do they go to the center of the head with no eyes, or do they go to the eyes on the periphery? Sure enough, he found evidence that we are drawn to eyes, not the center of the face. And the son, then 14, became ultimately the first author of a rather prestigious biological publication. I believe it was called Monsters Are People Too. Now, what can we learn from this? The moral of the story. We see here that we had this group of researchers that may have been largely homogenous. They all had similar backgrounds. However, when we introduced this diverse actor, this person who was a different age, who had a different background, for instance, played Dungeons and Dragons, they, working as a team, were able to achieve a more efficient, a better solution than they would have otherwise. Bringing in diverse perspectives can affect better invention, better solutions. And there's a large body of literature on this. We will not get into that today. So let's now start in our discussion of diversity and innovation. And we look back first about 100 years to a Department of Labor study which found that less than 2% of named inventors on US patents over a 10-year period ending in the early 1920s were women. And this is obviously a great disparity, and they recognize that maybe they're slightly undercounting because of a limitation we will see throughout the literature here, and we will probably see over the next several days, which is if we don't collect gender data, which the US Patent and Trademark Office does not, they need to identify people's gender by looking at their name. Here they went with a very conservative estimate and said, we will only identify individuals as a female inventor if we have, quote, no doubt of their sex. Now, they did note that the patents granted over this 10-year period, there were actually more patents granted to women inventors than in the entire prior history of the US Patent and Trademark Office. But we still see a huge disparity. Now, jump forward about 100 years. In the years 2016 and 2019, the USPTO found that female inventors represented between 12 and 13% of all inventors. And the gender gap in repeat inventors was likewise getting narrower, as we have seen, such that there were more women repeat inventors. But there's still a very slow pace towards parity, as Bell et al., a paper we'll talk about later, recognizes it could take 100 years at this rate to reach gender parity. I don't think that will be the case, but definitely not moving at a particularly rapid pace of change. In one other paper, recognized that within various industries, academia was the most likely to reach a narrower gender gap in patenting behaviors. Looking to racial disparities, here we have to look at it on a per capita basis, and we start with a study from Cook and her co-author, and it's an NBER paper that looked at data from 1970 to 2008 and found that African Americans received about 6 patents per million individuals. Women received, in comparison, about 40 patents per million. And the population at large, will note significantly higher number, received about 235 patents per million, a significant disparity amongst race and gender lines. And I will note that Dr. Cook actually is speaking tomorrow. I could have talked about her work in this realm a great deal, but recognizing that you will be hearing from her tomorrow, I didn't. So I highly encourage you to attend her session. Another study looking at data on male college graduates from 99 to 2003 found that 2.7% of male grads would apply for a patent. Again, looking at this in a comparative manner, we saw that Hispanic and Black male inventors applied at about 50% of that aggregate rate. Now, I will note that Amelia et al., that paper, they did find much closer to parity when they look to female graduates. Okay, now we've talked about the current lay of the land. We can also look to what a lot of people view as being a necessity, a requirement towards invention, which is a STEM degree, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education. And a study out of 2013 found that about a third of engineering students were women, or I'm sorry, of STEM students were women. And this got as large as about 48% if you included health fields as well, getting closer to parity, but certainly not there. Another piece of work from the Department of Education looked at STEM participation as a function of race, and they found that some minorities were underrepresented. Black individuals were about 8.4% of STEM students, as opposed to 13.4% of the population. Hispanic individuals were about 13.3% of the STEM students, but represented about 18.5% of the population, whereas Asian students were actually overrepresented. They accounted for over 12% of STEM students, despite being less than 6% of the aggregate population. So let's start to look beyond this to see to what extent the academic literature tells us this matters or doesn't. We look to a paper, NBER paper from Hunt et al., Why Don't Women Patent? And it looked to a 2003 survey of college graduates and found that, first, the same gender gap in invention that we have seen up to this point. About 7.5% of patents went to women. Now, the gender gap was even larger when we looked to commercialized patents. Women only accounted for the inventor on 5.5% of patents that would go on to have the technology commercialized. They also noted that STEM educated women were less likely to work in what they call patent centric fields like mechanical or electrical engineering. Now, whether or not people work in particular fields that happen to patent a lot, I don't know if that necessarily means that they are or are not innovating. And that's one area for additional research. But there were additional very important findings from this study, which is first that female STEM grads were less likely to work in their particular field of study. There's about a 3% gender gap. Not huge, but definitely not negligible. Moreover, female STEM graduates were less likely to work in a job where a STEM degree is required. And here the gender gap was about 13.5%, much more significant. Moreover, they found that female STEM grads were much less likely to spend at least 10% of their time working in research and development. So you note here that they're finding a lot of conclusions that aren't necessarily talking about whether or not there are individuals working in STEM, but how are these individuals that have STEM backgrounds different, or how are they behaving different or being utilized in a different manner? And to that end, they wanted to try to address what percentage of the gender gap in innovation could be accounted for by differences in STEM participation and by differences in how STEM grads engage in invention and patenting. And here they found that a lack of women in STEM education accounted for some of the disparity in patenting grant rates as a function of gender, but they found that the largest, most significant driver of the disparity in patenting by gender was amongst STEM grads. They found, consistent with all of the earlier conclusions from their paper, that it was differences between male and female STEM grads in their patenting activities that drove a large amount of the gender gap in patenting. And now this clearly is not a good thing, but it can also be recognized by those of you in industry as perhaps this is an area to explore. Is there a misallocation of highly educated individuals that maybe could be working in more inventive areas? Would that be a better allocation of highly qualified labor? I leave that up to you, but that's a question to be asked premised upon this. Another paper, similar idea, was from Ding et al. Gender differences in patenting in the academic life sciences. Here we look to professors in the life sciences over about a 30-year period, over 4,000 individuals, and look to their patenting behaviors. And consistent with what we've seen up to this point, the men in the study, about 13% of them had received a patent, whereas women in the study, about 5.65% had. The men who had a patent were likely to have about 3 patents each, whereas the women who had a patent were more on 1.8 patents each. And they ran a series of regressions, and they find that female professors patented about 40% the rate of their male counterparts who are equally well qualified in this particular field. And of course, the question becomes for both you and me and their research team, why? To this point, they moved from quantitative research to qualitative research. They started to ask interview questions to try to understand why we saw this difference in behavior. And they found 2 primary topics. One is that these female professors maintained fewer industry connections to bounce ideas off of, to recognize whether or not this is an area in which they should be investing their time in trying to secure a patent or not. Second, they found that disproportionately, female professors felt that patenting might interfere with their teaching or research. Now, again, these are not great findings, but they also recognize that there may be certain avenues for expanded research or cooperation between industry and academia. If one of the reasons that certain professors are not engaging in patenting behaviors is a lack of industry connections, maybe developing those connections creates a mutually beneficial relationship. Now, we continue on to a much more recent line of research. Bell et al., Who Becomes an Inventor in America? This is called the Lost Einsteins paper. And this paper analyzes patenting rate, first off, as a function of parents' income. So if as a child, your parents make more money, you're more likely to go on to become an inventor. Race and gender, we found the same disparities, or they found the same disparities that we have discussed up to this point. Now, they did have to control for the individual idiosyncrasies for each child to become an inventor, and therefore they obtained and controlled for standardized math test scores from when they were children, which is shown previously to correlate with inventive activity later in life. Now, their question, the why, is, well, what can we find that may drive some of these disparities that I just discussed? And first thing they look to is, was a parent an inventor? And if that's the case, your parent was an inventor, you are 9 times more likely to go on to become an inventor yourself. Moreover, you're more likely to follow in the same general area of technology. Now, this gets us started on the idea of, does a role model, someone that you can look to as a child, who will expose to you the capacity to become an inventor as a career, does that matter? Seems like it might, but let's continue our discussion. What about ignoring whether your parent themselves is an inventor? What if your parents just work in an inventive sector, such that your parents and their coworkers are more likely to be inventors? Sure enough, that correlates with an increased likelihood that a young person will go on to be an inventor. Well, now let's go even a bit further, even more macro. Let's look to the neighborhood, the geographic region upon which you lived, and ask if there is a lot of invention going on around you. Are you likely to go on to become an inventor, or more likely? And the answer is yes. Now, it's interesting to note that this continues on even if you move away later in life. You're more likely to become an inventor, and to become an inventor in the area that was dominant in the region that you were when you were a child. And this is also a gendered effect. They found that in areas where there were a great deal of male inventors, the young men were more likely to go on to become an inventor. In an area where there were a great deal of female inventors, the young women were increasingly likely to go on to become an inventor. And looking to this, they're able to tell us that differences in exposure to innovation help, quote, explain why talented children in low-income families, minorities, and women are significantly less likely to become inventors. A lot of it can be explained as a function to exposure to innovation early in life, to role models, to recognizing I can become an inventor. Now, like I said, that's an influential paper, and there's already follow-up studies coming on. And we have seen a current draft paper called Lost Marie Curies, which looks to a similar related question. It looks to citizens of Denmark and their behaviors in obtaining European patents. And first off, they find the same gender gap that we have discussed up to this point. But then they started to ask, well, what about the attributes of these inventors' parents? What can that tell us about whether or not a child will go on to become an inventor? And first, they found that a parent's education in STEM was likely or led to their children going on and becoming STEM educated. Now, this was gendered in that a mother who was STEM educated significantly increased the likelihood that her daughter would go on and become educated in a STEM field. Similar for dads and sons. Well, what about if the parents were inventors themselves? Again, like we saw in the Lost Einstein's paper, there was a significant increase in the likelihood that a child would go on to become an inventor if their parent was an inventor. However, here they noted that it was gendered in effect. What do I mean by that? The influence of either parent being an inventor disproportionately showed a likelihood of an increased chance that the son would become an inventor. They were influenced 2 to 3 times as much as the daughters. So we see a distinction between sons and daughters. I mean, is there some way in which these parents are treating children differently, or how do we explain this? And that was the question they wanted to answer. And I think they came up with a really interesting way to approach the topic, which was to look at family attributes. More specifically, they looked to families in which the first child was a daughter. And then they looked to the gender of the second child. Either a second child was a son, second child was a daughter. And they were curious as to whether or not there was some distinction between these two groups under the idea that maybe parents treated that first daughter differently depending on the gender of the second daughter. And I'm sorry, the second child. And they analyzed this and found that when there was a first child daughter, second child daughter, the impact, the increased likelihood of becoming an inventor because your parent was an inventor remained present. However, in a situation where there was a first child daughter, then a second child son, the increased likelihood that the first child daughter would go on to become an inventor because their parent was an inventor disappeared. There was no inventorship influence when you had a first child daughter who was followed within 5 years by a second child son. And they proposed several potential mechanisms, though they recognized that they did not study them and are only proposing them. One is that maybe there are some sort of latent stereotypes going on in the parenting behaviors here. They said it's also possible that parents recognize that the career outcomes of would-be inventors are, unfortunately, at this point in time, still different by gender. And maybe they intentionally reallocated their attention towards their sons, towards becoming an inventor. It's not a nice thing to think of, but this is a mechanism they proposed but did not actually study. Now, from here, we can look to a area that I've actually been involved in personally in a couple different studies, but we'll start out with an excellent paper from Nature Biotech by Jensen and team, in which they studied 2.7 million patent applications and looked to patenting outcomes as a function of gender. Now, the US Patent and Trademark Office does not collect information on the gender of applicants. Therefore, they had to identify the gender of each of these patent applicants by looking to Social Security data, and they used a couple of commercial databases. And then if a name was associated with a particular gender at a 95% threshold, they identified that person as being a male inventor or a female inventor. And they found significant disparities. They found that female patent applicants or female patentees first were less likely to appeal a rejected application either within the USPTO or to the federal courts, showing that the will to obtain these particular patents was lower for female inventors for whomever is controlling prosecution of that application. Second, they found that female inventors, once they secured their patent, were less likely to have the maintenance fees on that patent paid. Patents have to have maintenance fees paid at 4, 8, and 12 years, or they are no longer enforceable. So again, we saw that within that group of inventors, whoever currently owned and was responsible for the patent was less likely to think that it was worth continuing to be enforceable by paying this money. Then looking to outcomes at the USPTO, they found that a smaller portion of the claims in a patent application were likely to actually end up being allowed in the final patent, so fewer claims. They found that female inventors were more likely to have more words added to their claims, again, shrinking the breadth of patent protection, both of these outcomes, decreasing the aggregate value of the patent. And then they also found that female inventors were less likely to have subsequent patent applications cite to their patent. And this bears a bit of discussion. Citing to an earlier patent is where individuals associated with a patent filing say that technology is related to ours. We are distinct from it, but we still want the patent examiner to review it. It's evidence of continued development in the field and therefore has commonly been shown to correlate with value of a patent. The more citations your patent receives, usually the more valuable your patent is. Here we're seeing this discrepancy where patents granted to female inventors are receiving less citations. Well, what does this tell us? And how could we maybe disentangle any gender effects out of this? And I think that the researchers here did a very interesting, clever way to address that. They broke all inventors into 4 basic categories. Female inventors whose name was obviously gender identifying, Jessica. Male inventors whose name was obviously gender identifying, Michael. And then they recognized that there were 2 different groups in the middle. Inventors with a feminine, female specific name, but it was very, very rare, such that the average individual, you, me, someone at the patent office, someone who was looking to cite that patent, wouldn't recognize the gender, though it is gender specific. They identified a group of female and male inventors that had those kind of names. Then they compared the gender ambiguous or gender uncertain names for the women and men and found that compared to men with a gender ambiguous name, the women inventors with a gender ambiguous name actually received more citations. So maybe this tells us something about the behaviors of individuals choosing to make patent citations as a function of the perceived gender of the inventor they're citing to. Again, more research is necessary to flesh out that mechanism. Now, thus far, we've actually only talked about what I would consider the secondary findings of their study. The big finding was the grant rate of patent applications is a function of the gender of the named inventor. They found that women had their patents granted between 7 and 21% less often than their male counterparts, depending on the model that you look to. Now, the question becomes, why? Where does this discrepancy come from? Is there something different about the applications themselves? Is there something that's going on during patent examinations, some sort of mechanism whereby people who can be identified as women are getting their patents granted less often? And again, they look to a comparison of people whose name was gender identifying versus those who had a gender specific name that was so rare that the average individual, the average patent examiner, the average anyone would not recognize it as being gender specific. And they compared the grant rates to female inventors with a highly gendered name like Jessica to female inventors who had a gender-specific name, but it was very rare, such that most people would not recognize it as being gender-specific. And when they compared these two groups, they found that a substantial amount of the difference in grant rate, that's 7 to 21%, went away. Now, what the mechanism is that's going on here, they did not explore. And in a later paper, I've seen people talk about, or a team I was part of talked about maybe there's some sort of implicit bias. We have no reason to believe that there is anything intentionally nefarious going on during patent prosecution. We're not even sure what the mechanism is. Future research needs to be done there. I've talked about, what about inventor order? Does it matter if you have a group of men and women that are working together? If you put the woman's name first, does that influence grant rate as opposed to if a man's name was put first? Does a very masculine 100% male name, does that patent get granted more often than someone with a name who is indicative of being a man 75% of the time? What about disclosing individuals' genders via interviews with a patent examiner? Do these things matter? Have not looked into any of them. Areas of future research. Now, I want to look to a study that I was a part of, in which we were engaging in our same research at the same time as Jensen and that team. They published before we did, and we looked to the grant rate as a function of gender and race. And we found the similar disparity by gender. And then we looked to patent grant rate as a function of the inventor's race. And here we found that racial minorities, inventors, were less likely to receive a patent. Now, this again raised questions for us about why is that the case? Well, first off, to make sure we didn't miss anything, we controlled for technology classes, whether it was a domestic applicant, small entity, whether someone had an attorney representing them. We identified individuals being associated with a particular race if their name identified them as such at least 90% of the time. Our findings remain the same when we varied that threshold as high as 95, as low as 90 or 75%. And to try to address that question of why, we wanted to be able to compare the grant rates of individuals that were from a particular racial minority and could be identified as such from their name, compare them to individuals whose name was not identifiable with any particular race. And to do this, we looked to the voter rolls from 3 different states that have self-identified racial data and matched patent applicants to those voter rolls by looking at name and location, and then try to compare individuals and their grant rates as a function of whether or not they could be identified as being associated with a particular race or not. Did that influence grant rate? And again, we remember that the US Patent and Trademark Office does not collect gender or race data, and therefore the only information on that front that could be collected is from names. We found no disparity as a function of whether or not the inventor's race could be identified from their name. Now, that's a small group. It was only studied out of 3 states, so further research needs to be done, but we found no disparity like the one that was found with regard to gender. Both we found the same thing as Jensen et al., who had originally found it. Now, I want to briefly address that gender disparity through the lens of a second paper that I was part of a team on, in which we analyzed the registration rates of trademark applicants. And very, very high level review, we found that racial minorities were less likely to secure a trademark registration. And we found, different than the patent realm, that female applicants were more likely to secure a registration. And we then were curious whether or not there was any sort of bias similar to that found in Jensen. We compared trademark registrations as a function of a female applicant with a highly gendered name and a female applicant with a gender neutral name, those very rare names. And we found no distinction. Why is it that there's a distinction with regard to whether or not a male or female inventor could be identified versus a male, I'm say a female inventor could be identified versus a female would-be trademark registrant? This is definitely an area for future research. And lastly, I wanted to address a recent study from Science. This literally just came out in the last few months. Who do we invent for? And this study looked to biomedical patents from the year 1976 all the way up to 2010, and they pulled out keywords from these patents, ran them through a medical keyword database, and therefore were able to identify whether or not these patents claimed a technology that was specific to treatment of a particular gender. For example, a patent claiming a treatment for ovarian cancer would be specific to women. A patent claiming treatment for testicular cancer would be specific to men. And they then looked at this through the lens of diversity and innovation, and they were curious from the point of view of gender diversity whether or not female inventors were more likely to invent female-specific technologies in the medical area, or male, vice versa. And they found that female inventors were 35% more likely to be an inventor in women's health. Now, that may not be surprising to you. They address that point by saying, clearly, the lived experience of each individual inventor will expose them to different issues that may be solved. However, these are also likely highly educated individuals who are trained to identify needs and to address them. But sure enough, they found that female inventors were more likely to invent technologies for women's health. Now, what does this mean? Why does that finding matter? Let's think about it. If we have this significant gender gap amongst inventors, and we know that women are more likely to invent female-specific technologies, this may create a significant dearth in the types of technologies that are being created. We may be underinvesting in, we as a society may be underinvesting in certain areas of technologies because of the lack of diversity in the body doing the invention. Now, they followed up their studies by also looking to the upstream underlying research, and they found that same constant. Teams that were led by female researchers were more likely to do research into female-specific technologies. So, by not increasing here gender diversity, we may be losing out on important inventions that are gender specific. Now, I know we covered a lot of studies here, but I want to wrap up by first off saying thank you all But second, by recognizing that we talked about the current lay of the land and then we talked about impediments and shortcomings associated with a lack of diversity in invention, but we really didn't talk about the third area, which is what is going on inside firms, inside the actual organizations that are facilitating a great deal of invention. What is going on there such that we could do research to increase diversity in the inventive ecosystem? On that point, I want to go ahead and close and encourage you to ask any questions about the research I've discussed to this point, but in particular, if there's anything that you think that could be furthered in the research to address that third category of how do we incentivize diversity and innovation within the organizations responsible for a great deal of invention. So with that, I'll go ahead and open up the floor.